Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Xizhi. Coming up in this edition, Ukraine and the United States have reportedly reached an agreement on the minerals deal, which includes access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals. The United Nations has urged Israel and Hamas to move on to the next stage of the Gaza ceasefire deal, as the first phase of the deal will end soon. And British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged to accelerate his country's plan to increase the defence budget as he heads to Washington for talks. We begin with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Officials say Ukraine and the United States have reached an agreement on the minerals deal, which includes access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals. The agreement is part of Kyiv's efforts to win security support from Washington after U.S. President Donald Trump began direct talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Media reports say the deal has no security guarantees for Ukraine and makes no mention of the $500 billion figure demanded by Trump. The U.S. President says the minerals deal will recoup the billions of dollars owed by Ukraine to U.S. for military aid. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky could sign the deal during his visit to Washington as early as Friday. Ukraine has the largest titanium and lithium reserves in Europe, as well as significant rare earth deposits. These minerals are essential for high-tech industries, including the automotive, defense and medical sectors. Popin Putin has this report.
This deal has been in the works for the last few days, a variety of versions going back and forth between the Trump administration and Ukrainian representatives. What has been landed on, reports say, is that the United States will have 50% of future monetization of extracted minerals from Ukraine, including commodities such as oil, gas, lithium. 50%, that is significant. It's something that the Trump administration has really been making waves about because Donald Trump has been vociferous that Ukraine owes the United States in terms of the aid that it has received in its conflict with Russia. Now, of course, this likely wouldn't have been on the table had a different administration been in power. The previous U.S. administration very much supported Ukraine and sending aid to the country. Donald Trump has very warm and cordial relations, however, with Russian President Vladimir Putin, which has really set the stage for this deal. Very interesting to note that it is a bilateral deal. As much as Zelensky has been publicizing that it's part of his victory plan, that plan specifically noted the strategic partners of Ukraine might get access to the commodities of the country. But in this deal, it's strictly the United States that will benefit. The Europeans have been left very much flat-footed as Trump has charged ahead, essentially, holding, of course, that phone call a couple of weeks ago with Putin. And subsequently, we saw Russian and U.S. delegations in Saudi Arabia meeting to start talking about how a deal could be done. As much as there was a Paris summit by the Europeans, their response has been very much uncoordinated. This deal has been bashed out and has been struck. So it's really unclear right now just how much leverage the European partners of Ukraine have at this moment.
That was Popin Putin on the Ukraine-U.S. minerals deal. Meantime, Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country is open to more economic cooperation with the United States, including mining rare minerals and energy. This comes as Moscow and Washington are working to normalize relations after years of estrangement. Dasha Chinishova has more from Moscow.
Well, it is a very important statement that the Russian president has made it, and it does indicate the extent to which Russia is actually ready to normalize relations with the United States. So we've heard the Russian president saying that Russia is ready to invite foreign investors, foreign partners, including the American ones, to work on Russia's rare earth minerals, not just in the territories that have been Russian, but also the territories which Russia now considers as its own, the new regions, as Russia calls them. The understanding is that those could be potentially potentially both corporate and state companies involved into such projects. We also have heard the Russian president saying that Russia could become the major supplier of aluminium to the United States. All that comes as the negotiations between Russia and the United States on the resumption of dialogue and normalization of relations have started. We also understand that any such arrangements are possible only after this normalization period is done, after the diplomatic work is restored, and after the settlement on the conflict in Ukraine is actually worked out. That's according to the Kremlin statement that was made on Tuesday. So certainly it does show the extent to which Russia is ready to engage with the United States, and also shows us the parts of the possible deal that the sides could be negotiating on. Well, we've heard the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov being directly asked what Russia would say to the possible presence of the European peacekeepers in Ukraine. To that, the Kremlin spokesman has said he had nothing to add to the earlier statements made by the Russian foreign minister. Sergei Lavrov has said earlier that the presence of any European country troops, because of they are members of NATO, would mean that there are unacceptable threats created to the security of Russia. Therefore, that was completely unacceptable for Moscow. And certainly Moscow insists that that would be changing the security architecture and the security landscape, and Russia will be forced to respond to those actions. So at this stage, it is unacceptable for Moscow, as per the statements made by Sergei Lavrov. But at the same time, the Kremlin didn't want to directly respond to those statements made by the U.S. president.
That was Dasha Chernysheva in Moscow. The United States has sided with Russia on 2 United Nations resolutions on Ukraine. On Monday, the two countries opposed a UN General Assembly resolution supported by European countries which condemned Moscow's military actions in Ukraine. At the UN Security Council, both countries approved a US-backed resolution that avoided labeling Russia as the aggressor in the conflict. The move has surprised the international community. Stuart Smith has reactions following the vote.
It's a major change, one that diplomats in New York says they've not seen anything like since 1945. The first time the United States has voted with Russia against Europe at the UN on matters relating to European security. Hasn't happened before since 1945, and yet from here in Kiev there's been no direct criticism of the United States. President Zelensky, after that vote had been held, was talking at the G7 meeting where he said he had had a good call with President Donald Trump, and still he says Ukraine needs the United States as an ally and hopes that Washington and Brussels and other European countries can work together for a peace deal. Seemingly this the explanation as to why Ukraine hasn't publicly, at least, declared its opposition to the United States voting in this way. But instead, what we did get from diplomats and cabinet ministers was a repetition about why Ukraine feels this is so important. So in effect, a passive, perhaps, admonishment of the US position with these statements coming out. For example, the Ukrainian Prime Minister said that he expressed gratitude to the UN General Assembly for supporting the resolution, the one that did pass with those European amendments, and also emphasised it's a crucial step towards restoring the rule of international law. But the United States seemingly so important for Ukraine in this that public disagreements are not something Kiev is wanting at the moment.
That was Stuart Smith on the aftermath of a recent UN Security Council vote that has seen Washington and Moscow in rare agreement. Now turning to the Middle East, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says about 40,000 Palestinians have been removed from the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, where he has ordered a long-term military presence to prevent the return of residents. Jonathan Regev reports from Tel Aviv.
Israel is very much concerned of a rise in militant activity in the West Bank. We know that Hamas has gained a lot of popularity in the West Bank following the October 7th events, and perhaps more than all in the latest prisoner release from Israeli jails. Hamas has time and time again said that the way to release Palestinian prisoners is through violent actions, through kidnapping, as opposed to perhaps what the Palestinian Authority majority was saying throughout the years that the way to do it is through negotiations with Israel, and therefore, as the Palestinians are seeing more and more Palestinian prisoners released, and we're speaking of hundreds of them, even more in the last few weeks, then Hamas is gaining popularity, and Israel is concerned that those released from prisons will perhaps go back to militant action, and is also concerned from the popularity that this has given Hamas in the Palestinian street. This is something that Israeli politicians, mainly from the far right, have been talking about, the fact that these prisoners create danger for Israel, and therefore the Israeli army is having quite a strong presence in the West Bank, especially in the last few weeks. We're seeing very big operations in the Jenin refugee camp, in the Nur Shams refugee camp. Israel is hoping to prevent militant action from rising. There are some success points as far as Israel, but overall, still, militant action is widespread in the West Bank, especially in the area of the northern West Bank.
That was Jonathan Regev reporting. The United Nations is urging Israel and Hamas to move on to the next stage of the Gaza ceasefire deal. In a Security Council meeting on the situation in the Middle East, presided over by China, envoys heard testimony from a young woman held captive in Gaza. She pleaded with the international community to pursue the return of the remaining hostages. Hamas has insisted the last group of hostages won't be released until Israel pulls out of Gaza. Mitch McCann reports from New York.
The first phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is set to end this Saturday. Will there be a Phase 2 deal? Negotiations were due to start 3 weeks ago. They've yet to formally begin. At the United Nations on Tuesday, Noa Argamani told the Security Council to push for a deal as soon as possible. She was kidnapped on October 7, 2023, and spent 8 months in captivity before being rescued by Israeli soldiers.
We have no time. As I speak, there is still 63 hostages living in a nightmare, including my partner, Avinatan O. In fact, we believe that 24 of them are alive. Many of them send sight of life through released hostages. Our life cannot go without them.
UN officials shared those same sentiments.
The resumption of hostilities must be avoided at all cost, and I call on both sides to fully honour their commitments to the ceasefire deal and conclude negotiations for the second phase.
A Phase 2 deal is supposed to include a total Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, a permanent ceasefire, and the release of all Israeli hostages in exchange for hundreds more Palestinian prisoners. Israel says it won't withdraw from Gaza until the Hamas leadership is expelled from Gaza and the group dismantled. But Hamas insists it won't hand over the last hostages until Israel's withdrawal is complete. US representatives told the Security Council any long-term plan for peace requires Hamas to be removed, and said bold thinking is required to achieve a solution. Meanwhile, China's permanent representative to the United Nations said all parties must stick to the agreed course. With the clock ticking down until the 6-week peace agreement expires in the coming days, Israel and Hamas appear at odds over how to move forward, increasing the risk of renewed fighting.
That was Mitch McCann in New York. And finally, in Europe, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged to accelerate the country's plan to increase the defence budget. The announcement comes ahead of his trip to Washington to meet US President Donald Trump on Thursday. Starmer called the hike in the defence budget the biggest since the end of the Cold War.
So today I have announced the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We will keep our manifesto commitment to spend 2.5% of our GDP on defence. But in light of the grave threats that we face, we will bring forward that target so we meet it in 2027. That is an increase of £13.4 billion year on year compared to where we are today.
Starmer also expressed hope to bridge the divide between the US and Europe after Trump stunned Europe by initiating talks with Russia. In a recent phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron, the two leaders said they welcomed Trump's efforts towards a durable peace in Ukraine. Ollie Barrett reports from London.
The confirmation coming from Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, that the UK will get to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence by the year 2027. The government had always said it wanted to get to 2.5%, but hadn't said exactly how quickly it would get there. And the expectation had been that the current Labour government might suggest that it might take until around the end of the decade. So I think we can safely say that the timeline has been moved earlier by the UK government, particularly because of some of the issues you were mentioning around Ukraine peace negotiations, but also calls from the Trump administration in Washington for Europeans to commit more to spending on defence. The UK Prime Minister also said in the House of Commons behind me that he'd aim for the UK to get to around 3% of GDP being spent on defence in the following Parliament if the government were to be re-elected at the next election. With regard to how it pays for all of this, one of the ways that the government says it will pay is by cutting spending on international aid. Now, that will come down from 0.5% where it is at the moment to 0.3% of GDP in 2027. That doesn't pay for the entire bill when it comes to the uplift in defence spending, so still some questions to answer about how the government is going to pay for all of this, because Keir Starmer says it will mean £13 billion, around $16-17 billion of extra annual defence spending a year come 2027.
That was Ollie Barrett in London. Now a reminder of the headlines before we go. Ukraine and U.S. have reportedly reached an agreement on the minerals deal. The United Nations is urging Israel and Hamas to move on to the next stage of the Gaza ceasefire deal, as the first phase will end soon. And the British Prime Minister has pledged to accelerate his country's plan to increase the defence budget as he heads to Washington for talks with Donald Trump. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thanks for listening.